Proud supporters of Africa this week. Engine, with us, you are number one.
A new study of living standards shows millions of poor Kenyans defied the strong economic headwinds of 2008-2009 to increase their purchasing power and climb the social ladder. Joe Orton, Media Research and Monitoring Director at Synovate, explained.
We have seen Kenya urbanizing over the last 12 years or so. In 1999, when the census, the National Population and Housing Census data was released, we found that there was 24% of Kenyans living in urban areas. And in 2009, when the same data was, the same survey was carried out, we found that it was about 36% living in urban areas. Now, from the studies that we carry out in media research across the continent, we use a measure called the Living Standard Measure, which is an aggregate of household goods owned and an aggregate of what is owned and consumed to give a level of affluence of consumers. And what we found from this data is that Kenyans are actually becoming more affluent. Now, you will see that from the lowest levels of affluence, that those numbers are dropping. So the people at the lowest level of affluence are fewer and fewer than they were two or 3 years ago. And those on the middle level are actually higher. So we are seeing Kenya moving to a higher level of affluence.
And how will this affluence be impacted by the current inflationary trends? I mean, inflation ticking up 14.4%, prices rising. Their wages are not going particularly far.
No, well, you see, that's the thing, and that's the challenge I think that we face here in Africa. With inflation that moves from 4% 1 year ago, 14% now, how are employers supposed to deal with that? I remember when I was speaking to some foreigners once, and I told them that our inflation rate was in the double digits. They asked me whether we were receiving pay increases to deal with that, and obviously in Africa that's not the case. So it appears that people generally have to deal with those vagaries. But in relation to what we've just been talking about, we've been seeing about 5% growth. We've been seeing this consistently. So they are richer, even though they have to deal with the more short-term effects of inflation, as it were.
Let's define the middle class, because obviously you're tracking a living standards index. But some would say, truthfully speaking, the middle class have to be people who own an asset such as a property. There's a certain level of education they must have, and then those consumption patterns you refer to. Does that translate as the same thing in Kenya?
Well, it generally does, because once we've looked at these consumption patterns and these ownership patterns, we then define these target groups, or these consumer markets. And one of the things that we see is that it does follow that certain LSMs, or the higher LSMs, generally tend to be higher educated, earning more money, and owning more property than, say, those middle classes and the lower income groups. And of course, some of the challenges or the changes are between our market and, say, the more developed markets, is that if those people who are living under $1 a day, they usually tend to have ancestral land. They're growing their own crops, growing their own food, and that kind of thing. So the money is not necessarily translated into the actual standard of living.
South Africa's rail and freight group Transnet reported a rise in full-year profit and said it would spend 110 billion rand on capital investments in the next 5 years. It also said it is looking to buy back its government-guaranteed bond from the Public Investment Corporation. Samantha Loring spoke to Brian Molefe, CEO of Transnet, and asked him about the group and its large infrastructure program.
Financially, we have performed very well. We have had challenges in safety, with the number of fatalities having grown from 8 to 12 compared to the previous year. As well as productivity and efficiency indicators have not been very good. So going forward, we will be focusing on safety as well as the productivity and efficiency indicators.
Let's look at what you're doing to build capacity, because of course this is key to the economy. You've acknowledged that in many ways Transnet is holding back the economy from realizing its full potential by not being able to provide the service that is needed. When it comes to CapEx, you're planning on spending around 25.9 billion rand next year. Overall, your 5-year CapEx spend is estimated to be around 110 billion rand. Looking at the new multi-product pipeline from Joburg to Durban, how much is this costing you? This is a key area of CapEx spend, and what is the timeline for this project?
The total cost of the pipeline, which started a few years ago, will be 23.9 billion when it is completed. In December, we're taking delivery of the pipeline itself, and we'll be doubling our capacity of fuels and liquids that are transported on that pipeline to Johannesburg. So we'll be doubling the capacity, but we're going to continue to build the stations, the terminal in Durban, the terminal in Johannesburg, as well as the stations in between that are going to help to pump the fuels and increase the pressure on the pipeline. So that will be completed by 2013. So what we're going into now is the pipeline is operational, but not at full capacity. And then when we have the pump stations in place, it will work fully. But the problem really in Transnet is the problem of rail, and it is a problem of reliability. So we want to introduce a more reliable freight service. We'll be introducing a scheduled railway, scheduled maintenance, and making sure that our customers will receive their goods where they want them at the time that we promised. It doesn't have to be when the train arrives in Durban or in Cape Town, whatever, but it is the time that we promised so that they can plan. And that has been the biggest problem with the service that we provide on rail. On the port side, we really have a problem at one port only, and that is Durban Pier 2. And all our other ports function well. It's berth on arrival everywhere. We have very old equipment at Durban Pier 2, and we'll be replacing it during this financial year for delivery during the next financial year.
A recent report suggests that affirmative action policies have only had marginal effect in reducing unemployment in South Africa, and even less significant in bringing about changes in the labour market. Shamima Khaibi, Senior Director at Sheedle, Thompson and Haysom, was a keynote speaker at the 24th LexisNexis Annual Labour Law Conference that took place in Johannesburg this week.
The current legislation sets out two processes. So one is to try and colour and to transform the workplace so that the workplace is representative of people from disadvantaged categories. The other is to encourage employers to establish employment equity plans and to force them to submit those plans biannually so that the government is aware of what those plans are. The Act doesn't, however, have enforcement mechanisms in terms of for the purposes of the employment equity plans, and that means that you have a policy in place that doesn't have a biting or an enforcement mechanism. That's the downfall. Right. Insofar as the first part of the Act is concerned, and that deals with formal equality, that is meant to apply to situations where the government or the stated policy is that nobody is entitled to discriminate against people, and that is based on the assumption that everybody kind of starts off on the race at the same starting point, and then to replace that with more advantageous positions in terms of selection for future positions.
Where affirmative action has been introduced voluntarily by the employer, where it seems to be working, can you evaluate for us the quality? Because effectively we tend to see affirmative action as being directed at bringing blacks and particularly women into leadership positions in the workplace. Is it doing these things?
I think that's the misconception. I think that the way that affirmative action measures have been defined is that it's measures aimed at advancing and protecting people who come from disadvantaged communities in suitably qualified positions. That means that you've got to be in a position to contest or contend a position with other people who also qualified and who may come from other races. The current impact, my assessment of the current impact of affirmative action measures is that it has very minimal effect on employees who are lower down the scale, whereas it has a more resounding effect on people who are higher up the scale. The problem is that if it's not applied properly, it might widen the gap between those who are right at the bottom of the scale and those who are on top.
What does applied properly mean in a country where we've got a huge skills deficit and so many legacy issues at the same time?
I think that goes to the core of the affirmative action provisions in the Employment Equity Act, and that is that what the courts are trying to do is balance who's suitably qualified against the needs of a business. In the public service, you've got to balance suitably qualified with issues of representativity, efficiency, and service delivery. And the question is whether those concepts and those principles can be applied exclusively. Are they mutually separate or independent concepts, or can they be balanced in a way that advances affirmative action? And I don't think that our courts have got to the point of making that decision. What it has done is that it has compelled employers to ensure that when they apply affirmative action policies, they do so in policies that are stated, that are clear, that are rational, and that are fair. Employers are not allowed haphazard, erratic, or over hasty policies. So insofar as that has been applied, the courts are quite clear that it can't be on the basis of random positions or random choices. It's got to be on the basis of clear, identified, rational policies.